My name is Nora Whitcomb. I am 34 years old, and the moment that split my life in half did not happen in some courthouse, emergency room, or rain-soaked street where people expect lives to break. It happened beneath warm garden lights, beside a champagne tower and white roses, at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, while 60 guests smiled as if they were witnessing a beautiful family memory. I had flown into Tennessee telling myself I was older now, stronger, less hungry. I told myself distance had made me immune to them, or at least less available to the old little cuts that used to find me before I even saw the knife. I told myself maybe time had softened my parents, maybe age had humbled my father, maybe my mother had finally learned that image was not the same thing as love. For most of the night, I behaved exactly the way the Whitcombs preferred me to behave. I smiled in photos. I hugged aunts who still called me the artistic one in the same voice people use for damaged furniture. I answered questions about my work with just enough detail to sound polite, but not enough to invite judgment. I stood close enough to the family table to look included and far enough away to protect myself from being pulled into one of their little performances. Then my father lifted his glass. Harold Whitcomb had always known how to own a room. Even at 67, with silver hair, perfect tailoring, and that warm public voice people mistook for kindness, he could make everyone lean in as if wisdom were about to arrive. He waved me over, smiling with a softness that almost fooled me. He put one arm around my shoulders and pulled me against his side like he was proud of me. Like, for once, he wanted people to see me standing there. For half a second, I believed it. That was the humiliating part. Not what came next. The believing. He laughed into the microphone and said, and this one was our unexpected expense. The mistake we kept because Diane said returning children was frowned upon. The laughter came fast. Too fast. Like they had been waiting for permission. Before I could breathe, my mother leaned toward the microphone with that polished, diamond-bright smile of hers and added, she was never the useful one, but she did teach us patience. That got the bigger laugh. A few people looked down. My brother, Julian, stared into his drink like the bubbles had suddenly become fascinating. My father squeezed my shoulder, not affectionately, but as if reminding me not to move. My mother's eyes met mine for one clean second, and what I saw there was not regret. It was warning. Do not embarrass us by being hurt. So I smiled. That was the strange part. I smiled like a good sport. I smiled like the daughter who understood family humor. I smiled like my chest was not going hollow in front of people who had watched me spend my entire life trying to earn one seat at that table. I smiled because girls like me are trained early that reacting to cruelty is somehow worse than cruelty itself. The laughter kept ringing under the lights. Forks touched plates. Someone said, "Classic Harold." Someone else wiped their eyes like my humiliation had been entertainment worth remembering. And in that exact moment, something inside me went completely still. Before I tell you what I did after that smile, tell me where you are listening from and what the weather feels like there right now. I always wonder how far a story like this has to travel before it reaches someone who has been laughed at by the people who were supposed to protect them. I kept smiling for maybe 3 more seconds. Long enough to make sure no one could claim I had ruined the party. Long enough to let the room expose itself. Then I stepped out from under my father's arm. I handed my champagne glass to a passing waiter. I walked through the French doors into the house while the laughter was still floating behind me. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And that, more than the joke, told me everything. Inside the house, the air was cool and still. The music outside became muffled, as if I had stepped underwater. I picked up my purse from the entry table, took my coat from the back of a chair, and stood for a moment in the hallway beneath the family portraits. Those portraits were expensive lies. In every one of them, we looked elegant, close, permanent. Harold and Diane Whitcomb with their 2 children. Julian, the golden son. Nora, the difficult daughter arranged neatly at the edge of the frame. No one looking at those photographs would have known that affection in our house was never given freely. It was leased. It had terms. It could be revoked without notice. My father built Whitcomb and Vale interiors the way other men build monuments to themselves. Luxury lighting, custom furniture, design showrooms, private clients, old money pretending not to care about new money. He believed in reputation, control, discipline, and anything that could be photographed well. My mother, Diane, believed in harmony, by which she meant silence from anyone who made the family look complicated. Julian had been born knowing how to please them. He had the right school, the right laugh, the right arrogance, the right appetite for authority. He joined the company at 24 and was treated like a prince returning from war after learning how to use spreadsheets. I was the one they described with softer words. Creative. Sensitive. Unpredictable. Emotional. Hard to manage. Not built for serious things. By the time I reached the driveway, my hands were shaking so hard I dropped my keys twice before getting into the rental car. I did not cry. Not yet. My body was past crying. It was doing something colder. It was learning. I drove toward the Nashville airport with my phone face down in the cup holder. Calls and texts began lighting up the screen before I had even left the neighborhood. At a red light, I looked down and saw my mother's message. Do not turn this into one of your scenes. A minute later, Julian wrote. Dad was joking. Grow up. Then another. You always do this. You make people afraid to relax around you. I laughed once. A dry, broken sound that did not feel like mine. They had humiliated me in front of 60 people, and somehow I was still expected to protect their comfort. That was my role. The absorbent daughter. The quiet daughter. The daughter who converted damage into politeness before anyone else had to feel guilty. At the airport, I changed my flight, paid a disgusting amount for the last seat out, and sat near the gate staring at my reflection in the dark window. My makeup was still intact. That bothered me. I looked almost normal. Like nothing had happened. Like women are not taught to keep their faces presentable while their lives are being rearranged. That was where I understood something simple and final. If I went back again after that night, I would be teaching them that there was no line they could cross that I would not eventually crawl back over. So before boarding, I left the family group chat. I blocked every number I knew by memory. I logged out of the old email account my mother used when she wanted to send articles about forgiveness. I deleted shared albums, family calendars, old holiday threads, and every digital string that still tied me to the Whitcombs. By the time the plane lifted off, I had already decided they would never again get the version of me who kept showing up just to be wounded. I thought that flight was the end of the story. I was wrong. It was the first move. When I landed back in Santa Fe, the sky was just beginning to pale. The city looked quiet in that desert way, like it had no interest in chasing anyone who had finally escaped. I drove home through empty streets, let myself into my small adobe casita, and stood in the kitchen with my coat still on. No messages. No voices. No command waiting on the other side of the night. For the first time in years, silence did not feel lonely. It felt expensive. It felt earned. I slept until noon, woke with swollen eyes and a headache that felt like grief had taken physical form, and then I did something that would have looked small to anyone else and enormous to me. I made coffee. I opened my laptop. And I began cutting the Whitcombs out of my life like removing glass from a wound. I changed bank passwords. Updated client contracts. Moved my mailing address to a rented business box. Removed my parents as emergency contacts. Closed old accounts. Transferred files. Rebuilt everything that still gave them a doorway. My work then was uneven but mine. I helped boutique hospitality brands build client journeys that felt personal instead of automated. I wrote retention emails for a private wellness retreat. I redesigned customer follow-up systems for luxury skincare studios and independent hotels. It was not glamorous enough for my father. It was not impressive enough for my mother. It was not real enough for Julian. But it paid my rent. More importantly, it belonged to me. For the first few months after the anniversary, I lived like someone recovering from a storm no one else admitted had happened. I worked. I walked. I slept badly. Every time a car slowed outside my house, my body tightened before my mind could explain why. Every unexpected knock made me freeze. Every unknown number felt like a hand reaching through the wall. But Santa Fe kept giving me small proof that life could be built from gentleness, not just endurance. I found a yoga studio where nobody cared what my last name meant. I joined a creative business circle where people asked what I was building, not who my father was. A bookstore owner learned what kind of essays I liked. A barista started spelling my name right without asking. These things were not dramatic. They were better than dramatic. They were steady. I met Elias at a preservation fundraiser where I had designed the donor experience materials. He was an architect who restored historic buildings without stripping them of their scars. The first time we talked, he did not ask where I went to school or whether my family was the Whitcombs. He asked what kind of work made me lose track of time. I almost did not know how to answer. I was so used to being interpreted through my family's disappointment that being asked about joy felt almost suspicious. We started slowly. Coffee. Saturday markets. Long walks when the desert light turned gold and forgiving. Elias never pushed for stories I was not ready to tell. He had a rare gift. He made silence feel like space instead of punishment. That mattered more than I knew how to explain. My business changed, too. I stopped calling myself a freelancer and started acting like an owner. I built systems. Gathered testimonials. Raised my rates. Turned one-off projects into ongoing consulting. Then I shaped that consulting into a compact agency focused on loyalty strategy, customer retention, and digital experience for premium brands that wanted people to come back, not just click once and vanish. The numbers improved. So did I. I stopped waking up every morning trying to prove I was not useless. I woke up trying to sharpen what I already knew I could do. Sometime during the second year, I realized an entire week had passed without me thinking about my family. The first time it happened, I cried. The second time, I laughed. Eventually, it became my life. I began teaching online workshops for small business owners on rebuilding trust after brand damage. I never said it directly, but I knew what I was really studying. Recovery. Return. The architecture of trust after dismissal. How people come back from being reduced. How people survive when the room that raised them never learned how to hold them kindly. By the third year, I had clients in 4 states, real savings, a waiting list, friends who knew the difference between curiosity and intrusion, and a life that did not require me to flinch when someone said my name. I believed I had erased my family from the map of my days. Then, one bright Tuesday morning, I opened my front door and found 2 people standing there. One was a county deputy. The other was a woman in a navy coat holding a sealed folder with my old legal name printed across the front. For one wild second, I thought someone had died. The world tilted so sharply I had to grab the doorframe. The deputy spoke gently. There had been a serious medical event involving my father. My name still appeared on older trust and governance documents. Their office had been instructed to confirm delivery of urgent legal notice because repeated attempts to contact me had failed. I signed for the envelope with a hand that did not feel attached to me. After they left, I sat on the living room floor with the packet unopened for almost an hour. When I finally broke the seal, the papers were exactly the kind of thing my family would hide behind. There was notice of my father's stroke. Temporary governance restructuring. Trust language. Beneficiary standing. Fiduciary review. Company oversight. Legal phrases stacked so neatly they almost disguised the real message underneath. We found you. You are still useful. The letters started after that. Certified mail. Attorney emails. Voicemails from numbers I did not recognize. Handwritten notes from my mother that looked fragile until you read them twice. Nora, please do not make this uglier than it has to be. Nora, your father asks about you. Nora, this family needs unity right now. Nora, whatever happened in the past, this is bigger than your feelings. Then Julian came in person. I walked out of a client meeting downtown and saw him leaning against a black SUV like he had been waiting long enough to feel wronged by the inconvenience. He looked expensive, rested, and irritated, the exact way he always looked when reality failed to organize itself around his needs. He smiled when he saw me. There was no warmth in it. Only relief that the search was over. We met in a hotel lobby because I refused to bring him to my home. He skipped small talk. "Dad had a stroke," he said. "The company is exposed. The trust is being reviewed. You're still named in documents that should have been cleaned up years ago." I asked him what he wanted. He leaned back as if he were the reasonable one. "I want you to stop acting like a runaway teenager and come home long enough to sign what needs signing." The sentence was so polished it almost impressed me. He was not there because he missed me. He was there because I was inconvenient on paper. When I did not answer, he said my father was fragile, my mother was exhausted, and the board hated uncertainty. He said the company needed stability. He said family should not have to chase me into doing the right thing. Then he lowered his voice. "If you cooperate, this stays simple. If you don't, the lawyers will make you look unstable." That was the moment I stopped seeing my brother and started seeing exactly what he was. An operator protecting a throne he had mistaken for birthright. I told him no. He called me emotional. I told him to leave. 4 weeks after that, they pushed harder. My mother sent a photograph of my father in a hospital bed. Attorneys sent revised documents. A board member I had never met wrote that they hoped I would act in the best interest of the Whitcomb legacy. The phrase made me sick. At night, I barely slept. During the day, I canceled calls, postponed projects, and stood in my kitchen unable to remember why I had opened the refrigerator. Old shame came back in a form I recognized too well. It did not arrive as sadness. It arrived as confusion. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe disappearing had been childish. Maybe I owed them one final appearance. One final signature. One final performance of daughterhood so everyone else could stay comfortable. That is the cruelty of families like mine. They can make your own boundaries sound like crimes. My body knew before my mind did. My chest tightened when the mail truck stopped outside. My hands went cold when my phone buzzed. I started locking my door in daylight. I stopped going to yoga. I told Elias almost nothing at first because I was ashamed that people I had not spoken to in 3 years could still reach me through paper, pressure, and legal language. One night, after I jumped at an email notification, Elias looked at me for a long time and said, "This is not guilt. This is what being hunted looks like." I wanted to argue. Instead, I cried so hard I could not breathe. Every letter carried the same demand. Return. Yield. Shrink. Be useful again. And for a while, I was afraid they could still make me. My lowest point came on an ordinary afternoon. There was no dramatic collapse. No screaming. No single devastating phone call. I had just spent 3 days staring at legal documents, eating crackers over the sink, sleeping in pieces, and moving from chair to chair in my own house as if memory might not find me if I kept changing locations. Rain rolled in cold and sudden. I left the house without an umbrella because I could not stand hearing myself think. I walked until my clothes were soaked, then ducked into a used bookstore I had passed dozens of times. It smelled like paper, cedar, old lamps, and second chances. A woman at the register glanced up at my ruined mascara and nodded as if people came in looking haunted all the time. I wandered until a small blue book caught my eye. The title was The Power of the Quiet One. It did not save me in some magical way. It did not hand me a new spine in a single chapter. What it did was worse and better. It described, with painful clarity, how people who spend their lives being underestimated often mistake invisibility for weakness, when sometimes invisibility is simply unused power. I bought the book, took it to a corner cafe, and read until the rain stopped. Then I went home and did something harder than forgiving my family. I took inventory of myself. I opened client folders. I reread testimonials from founders who said my work had saved their customer retention. I studied revenue charts from campaigns I had designed. I read emails from business owners who trusted me with the fragile part of their brand, what happens after the first sale, when people either return or disappear. Evidence is powerful when your childhood trained you to distrust your own value. My family had built an identity for me out of jokes, labels, and convenience. But numbers do not care about family mythology. Results do not care who got the better seat at dinner. I was good at what I did. Not vaguely. Not emotionally. Not in the comforting way friends say nice things because they love you. I was measurably, repeatedly, professionally good. Once I let that truth in, the rest came fast. I cut 2 draining clients. I rebuilt my agency around lifecycle marketing and digital experience for premium hospitality, retail, and interior brands. I turned my workshop series into something sharper and called it Rebuilding Your Voice After Other People Reduce You. I never used the word family in the title. Everyone understood anyway. Registration filled faster than expected. A business podcast invited me on. A founder referred me to another founder. Then another. Money improved, but money was not the most important part. Momentum was. I stopped reacting. I started choosing. And eventually, that question led me right back to the one place I had sworn never to think about again. Whitcomb and Vale Interiors. The family business had once been one of those regional luxury companies everyone assumed would survive because it had history, pretty showrooms, and a last name that still opened doors. But history is not a strategy. Prestige is not infrastructure. A beautiful showroom cannot save a company that forgets how modern customers behave after they walk out. I began studying Whitcomb and Vale the way I would study any struggling client. Their website was beautiful and useless. Their social presence looked curated but lifeless. Their email system was an afterthought. Their post-purchase follow-up was almost non-existent. Their designer trade portal was embarrassing. There was no real digital path from inquiry to appointment to purchase to loyalty. They were still selling to a world that had already moved on. For the first time, I did not study my family to understand why they hurt me. I studied them to understand where they were vulnerable. That shift changed everything. Then my mother's final letter arrived. One line, written in shaky blue ink. Your father is dying. Please come home before it is too late. I read it twice. And felt something settle over me. Not panic. Not grief. Clarity. 3 years earlier, that sentence would have sent me running. This time, I set the letter down, poured a glass of water, opened my laptop, and began planning. The first person I called was not my mother. It was a lawyer named Camille Reyes, who had once helped one of my clients survive an ugly partnership dispute without burning the whole business down. She was precise, unsentimental, and blessedly unimpressed by family guilt. I sent her everything. Trust notices. Legal letters. Board emails. Julian's threats. My summary of what had happened at the anniversary and everything that followed. The second person I contacted was Marianne Holt, an investor I had met through a hospitality rebrand 2 years earlier. Her private group held a minority stake in Whitcomb and Vale from a financing round my father used to pretend had been strategic instead of desperate. Marianne was the kind of woman who made powerful men nervous by speaking very softly. When I asked whether she would talk off the record about the company's current condition, she said yes almost immediately. That was the first sign the cracks were wider than my family wanted anyone to know. Over the next 2 weeks, I built quietly. Methodically. I learned my father was not dying immediately, but he was weak enough after the stroke that the board was operating in a state of anxious half-transition. I learned Julian had been making aggressive staffing decisions, alienating senior designers, delaying vendor payments, and presenting polished summaries that disguised a worsening slide. I learned the company still had beautiful bones and terrible follow-through. They still knew how to impress people in person. They no longer knew how to keep people loyal. Camille confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Because I was still named in old trust and governance language, they could not erase me without process. Marianne confirmed something more important. The board was nervous enough to listen if the right proposal came from the right person with the right leverage. For the first time in my life, that person might be me. So I built a pitch deck called the Client Experience Recovery Plan. I made it sharper than anything I had ever created for my own agency because this was not just a business proposal. It was a counterargument to every careless thing my family had ever said about me. I mapped out how Whitcomb and Vale could modernize without destroying its identity. A digital concierge model for high-intent clients. A real designer trade portal. Lifecycle email flows based on browsing, consultation, and purchase behavior. Loyalty architecture around renovation cycles and repeat home projects. Paid traffic tied to showroom appointments instead of vanity impressions. Post-purchase care. Installation follow-up. Trade partner retention. Fewer glossy promises. More operational trust. Then I built the second file. The one labeled Julian. Exit interviews. Vendor complaints. Delayed approvals. Staff turnover patterns. Lost designer accounts. Contradictory staffing decisions. Inflated reports. Even the record of one attempt to push revised trust language before all beneficiaries had been properly notified. I was not inventing a case against him. I was organizing the one he had built himself. Elias watched it happen with a quiet awe that kept me steadier than he probably realized. One night, he asked, "Will going back reopen everything?" I told him the truth. Yes. But not the same way. I was not going back to ask why they hurt me. I was going back knowing exactly what I carried. That is the difference between fear and strategy. When I finally replied to my mother, my message was brief. I will come to Tennessee for a short visit. I will meet with legal counsel. I will review all governance materials. I will not stay at the family house. I did not mention Camille. I did not mention Marianne. I did not mention the deck. I did not mention the Julian file thick enough to bend when I picked it up. The flight to Nashville felt different from the one that had carried me away 3 years earlier. Then, I had been escaping. This time, I was arriving with tools. When I landed, I rented a car, checked into a hotel downtown instead of driving to my parents' house, and sat for 10 minutes in the parking garage with both hands resting calmly on the wheel. They thought I was coming back because guilt had worked. They thought grief had softened me. They thought the daughter who left in silence was finally ready to be folded back into the old machinery. They did not understand that I had spent 3 years becoming someone they no longer knew how to control. By the time I drove to the hospital the next morning, I was not returning as their mistake. I was returning as their consequence. The first time I saw my father after 3 years, he looked smaller than memory had allowed. Not kinder. Not transformed. Just smaller. Hospital light strips people down, and in that room Harold Whitcomb was no longer the booming man at the center of every table. He was a tired old man in a bed, with a face I had inherited more than I liked. He looked at me as if I were both comfort and punishment. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, rough with recovery and pride, "You came." I answered, "You sent legal notice through a deputy." He closed his eyes. Whether from shame or exhaustion, I could not tell. My mother arrived a few minutes later in a cream coat and controlled makeup, carrying panic beneath a perfect surface. She hugged me as if the walls might be watching. When I did not hug her back, she stepped away and started talking too quickly about medication, doctors, how hard everything had been. Not on me. Not on him. On everyone. Julian arrived late enough to signal importance and irritated enough to signal ownership. He looked at me the way he always had when he wanted me to remember I was on his ground. The old me might have shrunk. The new me observed. Over the next few days, I moved carefully. I met with the family attorney. Reviewed records. Visited the flagship showroom. Watched employees change when Julian entered a room. Their backs straightened, but their faces closed. Managers answered before he finished asking. A senior designer told me, with visible restraint, that follow-through had become unreliable and decisions changed depending on Julian's mood. Another said 3 experienced staff members had left in 6 months. A vendor I called under the pretense of research spoke for 20 minutes about delayed approvals, missed communication, and a leadership team that no longer understood its own promises. I listened. At dinner that week, my mother tried to recreate normal. She talked about floral arrangements for an upcoming donor luncheon. She complained about hospital parking. She referred to my hotel as if it were a tantrum instead of a boundary. Julian dismissed every business concern with the polished confidence of a man who had never been properly challenged. My father watched more than he spoke. The first real crack came during a governance review meeting, when Julian claimed recent turnover was part of modernizing the culture. One independent director asked whether losing 3 legacy managers and 2 major trade accounts in 1 quarter qualified as modernization. The silence that followed was brief, but sharp. That was when I understood what Marianne had meant. The board was ready to listen. They just needed an alternative strong enough to risk choosing. I gave them one. I requested a formal session and submitted my materials through counsel so no one could accuse me of walking in with family resentment disguised as strategy. Julian laughed when he heard. He told my mother that letting me present would only feed my need for attention. He said I had always mistaken creativity for competence. He was still reading from the old family script. He did not know I had stopped auditioning for the role. The meeting took place in the executive conference room at the flagship office. Polished wood. Stale coffee. Expensive silence. My father insisted on attending, although his doctor clearly disapproved. Marianne sat at one end of the table, still and unreadable. Camille joined remotely as counsel. Julian wore the expression of a man indulging a childish performance. I let him keep it. When my turn came, I did not begin with my pain. I began with customer behavior. I showed how Whitcomb and Vale was losing attention after first inquiry, losing trust after purchase, and losing repeat business because no one owned the client experience after the showroom visit. I walked them through the gap between how the company saw itself and how the market actually behaved. Broken follow-up systems. Stale digital pathways. Designer friction. A measurable drop in repeat purchase behavior that could not be dismissed as seasonal softness. Then I showed the roadmap. Digital concierge. Trade portal. Segmented lifecycle communication. Loyalty strategy around renovation cycles. Appointment to purchase infrastructure. Post-installation care. Retention instead of endless acquisition panic. I showed them what growth could look like if the company stopped treating digital like decoration and started treating it like survival. No one interrupted. Even Julian stayed quiet, although his jaw tightened with every slide. When I finished the strategy section, one director asked how quickly a division like that could be built. I answered without hesitation. 90 days for structure. 180 for rollout. 12 months for measurable turnaround if leadership alignment is real. That was when Julian laughed. Leadership alignment, he said. That is rich coming from someone who ran away and built a little email business in the desert. My mother flinched. My father looked down. 3 years earlier, that sentence would have gutted me. This time, it was useful. It gave me the opening I needed. I clicked to the second half of the presentation. Since leadership has come up, I said, let us discuss operational stewardship. What followed was devastating because I kept my voice calm. I laid out delayed vendor payments, contradictory staffing decisions, trade partner losses, inflated internal reporting, intimidation patterns, staff turnover, and the gap between Julian's narrative and actual business performance. I showed account churn. Memo trails. Timeline conflicts. Then I placed a hard copy dossier in front of every voting member. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just facts arranged so cleanly that denial would require more energy than honesty. Julian's face changed from amusement to irritation. Then from irritation to disbelief. Then from disbelief to rage. He tried to argue that everyone makes hard decisions under pressure. He tried to turn the room toward my absence, my sensitivity, my personal resentment. But every time he reached for the family story, the numbers dragged the room back to performance. At one point, he looked to my father for rescue. That was the only moment that felt brutally personal. My father lifted his eyes, looked at both of us, and said in a voice weaker than I remembered but truer than anything I had heard from him in years. "Sit down, Julian." The room went still. It was not redemption. It did not repair my childhood. But it was the first time in my life my father refused to protect the child he had always chosen over me. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The board approved the immediate formation of a client growth and digital experience division and appointed me to lead it with direct oversight across customer retention, trade experience, and digital modernization. They also voted for an independent audit of recent operational decisions and placed Julian on leave pending review. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor hard enough to make my mother jump. For a second, he looked less like an executive under attack and more like a boy discovering the room no longer revolved around his confidence. He pointed at me. "This is revenge." I looked at him and said, "No. Revenge would have been letting you finish destroying what Dad handed you." Then I stepped into the hallway, placed one hand against the wall, and let my body shake. Because even victory can frighten you when it arrives wearing the face of what once terrified you. The months that followed were harder than revenge stories like to admit. Turning around a business is work. Rebuilding trust is work. Creating systems where ego used to live is work. But work, I understand. I rehired 2 people Julian had pushed out. Rebuilt trade communication. Modernized post-purchase follow-up. Repaired vendor relationships. Reworked the digital journey without flattening the brand's heritage. I made respect operational, not optional. Revenue did not transform overnight. It stabilized. Then improved. Then started growing in ways no one could dismiss as luck. The most satisfying moment did not happen in that conference room. It happened 8 months later at a town hall and trade partner luncheon inside the flagship showroom. My mother stood at the podium, elegant and tightly controlled, introducing the company's new direction. Her voice caught when she said my name. She had to say it clearly in front of employees, partners, designers, vendors, and board members who now understood exactly who had kept Whitcomb and Vale from sliding further. My father, retired by then and leaning on a cane, took the microphone afterward. He looked older than I wanted him to look and less powerful than I once needed him to be. He said, "I underestimated my daughter for most of her life. This company is standing today because she did not make the same mistake." People applauded. My mother cried carefully. Julian was not there. Officially, he resigned before the audit concluded. Everyone who mattered knew better. And this is where most people expect me to say that hearing my father acknowledge me healed something. That I forgave them. That the family became softer. That the daughter finally got her place at the table and discovered the table had been waiting for her all along. But that is not what happened. Because some tables are not worth returning to. 2 weeks after the town hall, I made the decision that caused more family outrage than anything else I had done. I recommended that the company remove the Whitcomb name from public branding. Not immediately. Not recklessly. But deliberately, over a staged transition. My mother said it was cruel. Julian called it erasure. My father stared at the proposal for a long time and asked if I hated him that much. I told him the truth. No. I just do not believe a company should keep kneeling before a name that almost killed it. The room went silent. That was the controversial ending they never forgave me for. I did not destroy the company. I saved it. Then I took our name off the door. Within a year, Whitcomb and Vale became Vale House. Cleaner. Stronger. Less trapped under the mythology of one family's ego. The old clients complained for 3 weeks. The new clients did not care. Revenue climbed. Trade partnerships returned. The apprenticeship program I launched brought in young designers from overlooked backgrounds, people with talent but not polish, ability but not connections. I funded it through the same division my family once laughed at as my little email business. That may be the closest thing to grace in this story. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Proof. My mother still says I went too far. She tells people I saved the company but broke the family. Julian tells anyone who will listen that I planned it all from the beginning, that I came back not as a daughter but as an executioner. Maybe that is why the ending bothers people. Because they want wounded daughters to become generous once they win. They want us to prove our goodness by preserving the pride of the people who humiliated us. But I learned something they never taught me. Mercy without boundaries is just another cage. My father and I speak occasionally. Carefully. Honestly, in small doses. He has apologized more than once, but apologies do not refund years. My mother still prefers edited memories. I do not let her hand them to me anymore. Julian still appears at some family events, wearing his old swagger like a suit that no longer fits. The difference is, nobody rearranges the room around him now. Elias and I kept the life we built in Santa Fe. I never moved back into the family orbit. I lead Vale House on terms that protect the woman I became without them. I keep my own home, my own accounts, my own locked doors, my own quiet. And when I say no now, the word stays no. If there is a lesson in what happened to me, it is not that success erases pain. It does not. It is not that family eventually understands. Sometimes they only understand consequences. And it is not that being publicly acknowledged by people who once dismissed you will finally make you whole. Sometimes the most powerful thing is not being welcomed back. Sometimes the most powerful thing is returning just long enough to take your life out of their hands. My father once pulled me close in front of a crowd and called me the mistake they decided to keep. In the end, the truth was much simpler. I was never their mistake. I was the person they failed to recognize until the day they needed what I had built without them. And by then, I no longer needed their name, their approval, or their table to know exactly who I was.